Hello there, and welcome back to Midnight Creaks. The Pacific Northwest is known for its endless evergreen forests, its mist-covered mountains, and the things that hide inside them. Tonight, we're heading into the rain-soaked corners of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho to uncover 5 true accounts from those who saw something they weren't supposed to. From a mechanic who found the grim reason a theme park ride was shut down, to a trash collector forced to make a horrific choice. If you enjoy disturbing true-style horror stories, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload. Now, dim the lights, put your headphones on, and let's begin. I still think about that car every single day. This happened on January 2nd of this year, and I'm a detective with the Oregon State Police. I'd been with the department for about 28 years at that point, and I thought I'd seen everything. I was wrong. I need to back up a little first. Back in January of 1995, there was this case that haunted everyone in our department. A 19-year-old girl named Heather Garner vanished on New Year's Eve while driving home from a party near Mount Hood. She was driving her dad's 1995 Honda Civic Champagne Gold, and she just disappeared. No body, no car, no witnesses, just gone. I was a rookie back then, barely 23 years old, and I remember how desperately we searched those mountain roads. We figured she slid off into a ravine somewhere or got lost in the woods. The Cascades can swallow you whole if you're not careful. Her father, Alan, never gave up. I'd see him every few months coming into the station asking if there were any updates. The youth, man, aged 20 years in the span of 5. It was brutal to watch. Eventually, the visits became less frequent, and then they stopped altogether. The case went cold and got filed away with all the other unsolved disappearances. I thought about Heather sometimes, but honestly, after 3 decades, you learn to compartmentalize. You have to, or this job will destroy you. So when I got the call on January the 2nd about a suspicious vehicle found on Forest Road 42 near Government Camp, I wasn't expecting anything unusual. Dispatch said a logging crew had spotted an older sedan parked in a turnout. The plates were expired and it looked abandoned. I figured it was probably stolen, dumped after a joyride, or maybe someone's winter beater that finally gave out. I grabbed my gear and headed up the mountain. The drive took about 40 minutes. It was one of those clear, cold mornings where the sky is so blue it almost hurts to look at. There was snow everywhere from the storm we'd had on New Year's Eve. The easy road had been plowed, but the shoulders were still piled high with it. When I pulled into the turnout, I saw the car immediately and my stomach dropped. It was a champagne gold Honda Civic. I parked behind it and just sat there for a moment, staring at it through my windshield. The car looked immaculate. I mean, showroom perfect. The paint was glossy, there wasn't a single dent or scratch, and the tires looked brand new. I could see my reflection in the side panels. That's when I knew something was very wrong. A car that's been sitting in the elements for 30 years doesn't look like that. Hell, a car that's been sitting for 30 days doesn't look like that. I got out and walked around it slowly, taking everything in. The license plate confirmed what I already suspected. It was Heather's car. The plate had expired in January of 1996, just 1 month after she vanished. I pulled out my phone and called it in, telling dispatch to get a forensics team up here as fast as possible. My hands were shaking as I put on my gloves. I'd been a cop long enough to know you don't touch anything at a scene like this, but I had to look inside. I cupped my hands against the driver's side window and peered in. The interior was pristine. The seats looked like they'd just been vacuumed. There was a Burger King bag sitting on the passenger seat. That detail hit me hard because I remembered from the case file that Heather had stopped at Burger King on her way to the party. The bag looked old, the paper was yellowed, but it wasn't moldy or falling apart. I moved to the back window. The back seat was empty, except for a small pine tree air freshener hanging from the headrest. That's when I noticed the smell. Even through the closed windows, I could smell it. New car smell mixed with something sweet. Vanilla, maybe. It was unsettling. This car should smell like mildew and decay. Instead, it smelled like someone had just detailed it. I walked around to the trunk, and that's when my training kicked in. I shouldn't open anything without forensics present, but something told me I needed to see what was in there. I used my pen to pop the trunk release through the driver's side door. The trunk lid lifted with a soft click. Inside was a wool blanket folded neatly in the corner. I lifted it carefully with my pen. Underneath was a cell phone. But not a phone from 1995. This was a BlackBerry, one of those older models with the full keyboard. I'd say it was from around 2010, maybe 2012. My heart started pounding. This didn't make sense. Why would there be a phone from 2010 in a car that vanished in 1995? I pulled out my own phone and took pictures of everything. The BlackBerry screen was dark, but when I pressed the power button, it lit up. It was fully charged. I scrolled through it. There was only one contact saved. It just said Dad. I opened the messages. There was one draft text that was never sent. It read, "I see you got a new dog. He looks nice." I felt my blood run cold. Alan Garner had gotten a golden retriever in 2011. I remembered because he'd brought the dog to the station once. Someone had been watching him. Someone had bought this phone specifically to send that message and then decided not to. Why? What kind of person does that? The forensics team arrived about an hour later. I filled them in on everything, and they got to work. They processed the entire car, photographing every inch, dusting for prints, testing for DNA. I stood back and watched, trying to make sense of it all. One of the techs called me over. She'd been examining the wheel wells. She showed me the soil samples she'd collected. It wasn't mud or dirt from the forest. It was concrete dust mixed with those tiny white pellets. She said they looked like desiccant pellets, the kind you use in dehumidifiers. That meant this car hadn't been sitting outside, rusting away in some ravine. It had been stored indoors, somewhere climate controlled, somewhere underground maybe. I went back to the passenger seat. The Burger King bag was still sitting there mocking me. I opened it carefully. Inside were fries. They were petrified hard as rocks, but they weren't moldy. There was also a receipt. The date on it was December 31st, 1995. The timestamp said 9:47 p.m. Heather had vanished sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight according to the original case file. Then I saw it. On the dashboard, partially hidden behind the sun visor, was a party tiara, one of those cheap plastic ones you get at Party City. It had Happy 1996 written across the front in glittery letters. I told the tech to bag it immediately. She lifted a fingerprint from the inside band. We ran the print through the system. It came back with a match, a guy named Gordon Mullen. I remembered that name from the original investigation. He'd been a person of interest back in 1995. He worked at a mechanic shop that Heather had taken her dad's car to a week before she vanished. He'd been questioned and cleared because his alibi checked out. His own car had broken down that night and he'd been stranded at home. At least that's what he claimed. I pulled his file. He was 58 years old now, still lived in the same house on the outskirts of Sandy, Oregon. I got a warrant and assembled a team. We drove out there that same afternoon. The house was a small rundown place, set back from the road surrounded by pine trees. There was a detached garage and what looked like an old barn behind the main structure. We knocked. No answer. We announced ourselves, still nothing. We breached the door and cleared the house room by room. It was empty. Mullen was gone. But the house told us everything we needed to know. The living room was frozen in time. There was a TV old tube style with a VCR hooked up to it. There were VHS tapes stacked on the shelf. I picked one up. It was labeled New Year 1996 Times Square Ball Drop. One of the officers called me from outside. They'd found something behind the barn. It was a buried shipping container. The kind you see on freight trains. Someone had dug it into the hillside and covered the entrance with a false wall of stacked firewood. We pulled the wood away and found a metal door with a heavy padlock. We cut the lock and opened it. Inside was a nightmare. The container had been converted into a climate-controlled garage. There were industrial dehumidifiers running. LED strips provided lighting. And there were 2 parking spaces marked with painted lines on the concrete floor. The first space was empty. There was a sign above it that said Heather 1995. The second space was occupied. A 2002 Toyota Camry sat there pristine and perfect, just like Heather's Honda had been. The sign above it read Sophia 2002. I ran the plates. The car had been reported stolen in April of 2002. The owner was a 24-year-old woman named Sophia Harner. She'd vanished without a trace. We called in more units. We processed the entire scene. But Mullen was in the wind. He'd cleared out before we got there. He knew we were coming. The walls of the container were covered with photographs. Pictures of Heather from 1995, pictures of Sophia from 2002. But there were also recent photos. Pictures of Alan Garner walking his dog. Pictures of Sophia's mother shopping at the grocery store. This guy had been watching these families for decades. I was the one who had to call Alan. I told him we'd found Heather's car. I told him we had a suspect. I didn't tell him about the photos or the underground garage or the fact that this monster had been watching him for years. I couldn't. Not over the phone. He started crying. He asked me if we'd found Heather. I had to tell him no. Just the car. We searched for Gordon Mullen for weeks. We put out alerts. We checked every property he'd ever owned or rented. Nothing. The guy was a ghost. And then on February the 14th, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was calm. Older, male. He, said Detective Emery, I assume you found my workshop by now. I hope you appreciated the care I put into preserving those vehicles. It's important to maintain history, don't you think? I tried to keep him talking. I asked him where he was. He laughed. He said, I'm where I've always been. Watching. Waiting. Then he said something that made my skin crawl. He said, keep an eye out for the Camry detective. I'm almost done with her. Then the line went dead. We traced the call. It came from a burner phone somewhere in Washington State, but by the time we got there, the trail was cold. I still get calls sometimes. Never from the same number twice. He never says much. Just little comments, little reminders that he's still out there, still watching. I think about those cars a lot. I think about how much time and effort it took to keep them in perfect condition. How he must have spent hours cleaning them, waxing them, making sure every detail was exactly as it had been. That level of obsession is something I can't wrap my head around. He didn't just take these women. He took their last moments and turned them into some kind of sick museum exhibit. The case is still open. We're still looking for him. But deep down, I know we won't find him until he wants to be found. And that's what keeps me up at night. Not knowing when he'll release the Camry. Not knowing if there are other containers out there, other spaces with other names. I drive those mountain roads sometimes, and I can't help but wonder. How many cars are hidden away in climate-controlled bunkers, waiting to be returned after decades of careful preservation? How many families are still waiting for answers? I never told Alan about the phone calls. I couldn't do that to him. But I think about that draft text a lot. I see you got a new dog. He looks nice. Mullen was close enough to watch Alan's daily life. Close enough to know when he got a new pet, and he chose not to send the message. Why? Was it mercy? Was it restraint? Or was it just another way to maintain control? I don't have answers. I probably never will. All I know is that somewhere out there, Gordon Mullen is maintaining his collection. Polishing the chrome, vacuuming the seats, preserving history in his own twisted way. And when he's ready, when he's decided he's done with Sophia's memory, he'll leave that Camry somewhere for us to find. Immaculate. Perfect. Frozen in time. I just hope we find him before he adds another name to his list. I still think about that morning every single day. It's been 3 years and I haven't slept right since. What I'm about to tell you isn't something I've shared with many people. In fact, I've actively avoided talking about it. But it eats at me, and I think maybe if I tell someone, it'll stop replaying in my head every time I close my eyes. This happened in early January 2023. I was working for Cascade Waste Solutions, a private contractor that handled garbage collection for the city of Seattle and some of the surrounding areas. The pay was decent, and honestly, I didn't mind the work. You show up early, you drive your route, you go home. There's something almost meditative about it when you get into a rhythm. No office politics, no customers, breathing down your neck, just you and the truck and the road. My name is Leo Reynolds, and I'd been driving for Cascade for about 4 years at that point. I knew most of the routes by heart, and I'd gotten pretty good at eyeballing the weight of bags. Before I even touched them, you develop instincts in this line of work. You learn what regular trash feels like, what recycling sounds like when it hits the hopper. You learn the difference between household waste and construction debris just by the way a bag sits on the curb. Every year, right after New Year's, I'd get assigned what we called a special pickup. It was always the same location. A fenced lot near the old Weyerhaeuser paper mill site on the industrial outskirts, south of Seattle near Tacoma. The area was pretty desolate. Mostly abandoned warehouses, crumbling concrete, and overgrown railroad tracks that hadn't seen a train in decades. The whole place had this eerie fog that seemed to hang there permanently, rolling in off the sound and mixing with the industrial haze. The work order always came through the same way. A printed manifest clipped to my route sheet with a note that said, Priority Special Collection, and the client listed as City Abatement Services, LLC. The two instructions were simple. Show up at the address, pick up approximately 20 black contractor bags, load them into the truck, and proceed directly to the regional landfill for immediate disposal. No sorting, no recycling, just straight to the pit. I'd done this pickup 3 times before without incident. It was always scheduled for January 2nd, like clockwork. The bags were always heavy, and they always had this weird chemical smell, like bleach mixed with sawdust. I'd asked my supervisor about it once, and he just shrugged and said it was probably cleaning supplies or something from a city facility. The manifest always labeled it as organic waste animal control, which I thought was odd, but I didn't ask too many questions. In this job, you learn pretty quickly that asking questions just gets you more work. But that 4th year, something felt different from the moment I pulled up to the lot. The fog was thicker than usual, and the gate, which was normally padlocked shut, was standing wide, open. I could see the bags lined up just inside, about 30 feet from the fence. They looked the same as always. Heavy-duty black contractor bags, the kind you'd use for a demolition project or a major cleanup job. I backed the truck up to the gate and climbed out. The air was damp and cold, and I could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere nearby. The silence was unsettling. Normally, even in industrial areas, you hear something. Traffic in the distance, birds, machinery humming. But that morning it was dead quiet, except for the occasional groan of the truck's engine cooling down. I grabbed the first bag, and immediately I knew something was wrong. The weight was all wrong. Trash has a certain give to it, you know? Even heavy trash will slump or shift when you lift it. This bag felt solid, dense, like it was packed with something that didn't compress. I hefted it into the hopper, trying to shake off the feeling, and moved on to the next one. The second bag felt the same. So did the third. By the time I got to the 5th bag, I was actively trying not to think about it. I told myself it was just compacted dirt or maybe wet sand from some kind of construction cleanup. But the smell was getting to me. It wasn't rot. It wasn't garbage. It was that same chemical smell, but stronger this time. Like someone had doused whatever was in these bags with bleach and then wrapped them up tight. I was about like halfway through the pile when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. One of the bags near the back had a tear in it, probably from being dragged across the rough concrete. Through the tear, I could see fabric. Not just any fabric, but the kind of nylon you see on sleeping bags or winter coats. Bright blue. And there was a zipper. I stood there for a long moment just staring at it. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to call my supervisor, to do anything except look inside that bag. But I couldn't stop myself. I walked over and crouched down. My hands were shaking as I pulled the tier wider. Inside the bag was a person. He was curled up in a fetal position, wrapped in a blue sleeping bag. His skin was gray, almost blue, and his lips were cracked and covered in frost. For a second, I thought he was dead. I honestly thought I was looking at a corpse. But then his eyes opened. I literally jumped back so hard I fell on my ass. He was alive. Barely. His eyes were glassy and unfocused, and he wasn't moving except for these tiny, shallow breaths that barely fogged the cold air. He looked at me, but I don't think he saw me. He was somewhere else, locked inside his own head. I scrambled to my feet and ran back to the truck. My mind was racing. I needed to call 911. I needed to get this guy help. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers numb and clumsy. And that's when I heard the second truck pull up behind me. It was Gus Solis, my route partner. He was driving the secondary truck that was supposed to help with overflow if the load was too big for one vehicle. Gus was older than me, maybe mid-50s, and he'd been in waste management for over 20 years. He had this gruff, no-nonsense attitude, and he didn't talk much, which I'd always appreciated. But the way he looked at me that morning made my blood run cold. He climbed out of his truck and walked over. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just looked at the torn bag, then back at me. "You opened it," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. My throat was so tight I could barely speak. "Gus, there's a guy in there. He's alive. We need to—" "No," Gus said flatly. He walked past me and looked down at the bag. Then he looked at the others. "How many did you load already?" "5, maybe 6, I said. "Gus, we have to call someone. This guy needs a hospital." Gus didn't answer. He just walked back to his truck, opened the door, and hit a button on the console. I heard the hydraulic whine of my truck's compactor start up. "What are you doing?" I shouted. I started running toward my truck. But Gus stepped in front of me. "Don't," he said. His voice was calm, almost bored. "It's just a junkie, Leo. We're behind schedule." I stared at him. I couldn't process what he was saying. The compactor blade was already starting to descend, crushing everything in the hopper. If there were more people in those bags, I'd already loaded. "Gus, stop it," I said. My voice was shaking. "Stop the truck. We have to finish the route," Gus said. He put a hand on my shoulder and his grip was firm. Too firm. "You don't want to ask questions about this, Leo. Trust me." I shoved his hand off and ran to the truck. I hit the emergency stop and the compactor froze mid-cycle. Gus swore behind me, but I didn't care. I pulled out my phone and started dialing 911. That's when Gus grabbed my wrist. His face was inches from mine, and for the first time I saw something in his eyes that terrified me. It wasn't anger, it was pity. "You don't know what you're doing," he said quietly. "This isn't some accident, Leo. This is a city contract. You call the cops and you're the one who's going to disappear." I yanked my arm free and stepped back. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. Gus didn't move. He just stood there watching me like he was waiting to see what I'd do. I ran. I didn't grab my stuff. I didn't even close the truck door. I just bolted. I ran down the road, past the fence, past the abandoned warehouses until my lungs were screaming and my legs gave out. I collapsed against the side of a rusted storage container and pulled out my phone again. This time I made the call. The police showed up about 20 minutes later. I told them everything. I showed them the location. I gave them the manifest. They took notes. And they asked a lot of questions, and then they told me to wait in the patrol car while they checked it out. When they came back, their faces were blank. "There's nothing there, son," the older officer said. He was in his 50s, balding, with a thick mustache. His name tag said Halverson. "What do you mean there's nothing there?" I said. "The bags were right inside the gate. There were at least 15 more. "The lot's empty," Halverson said. "No bags, no trucks, no evidence of any collection activity." I felt like the ground was falling out from under me. "That's impossible. I was just there. My truck—" "Your truck is gone," the younger officer said. She was watching me with this careful expression like she thought I might be dangerous. "We ran the plates you gave us. Cascade Waste Solutions says that truck was reported stolen this morning." I couldn't breathe. No, that doesn't make sense. I was driving it. I've been driving it for 4 years. "Look," Halverson said. He leaned against the patrol car and crossed his arms. "I don't know what you think you saw, but I'm telling you right now there's nothing at that site. If you want to file a report, we can do that, but I'm going to be honest with you. Accusing the city of covering up murders is a serious claim. You better be real sure before you go down that road." I opened my mouth to argue, but but the look on his face stopped me cold. It wasn't skepticism. It wasn't even annoyance. It was a warning. They drove me to the nearest bus stop and told me to go home and sleep it off. I didn't argue. I just got out of the car and watched them drive away. I didn't go home. I went to a library and I started digging. I looked up City Abatement Services, LLC. The address on the manifest led to a P.O. box. The phone number was disconnected. The business registration showed it was a shell company with a single listed officer, a name I didn't recognize. When I searched for that name, I found nothing. No social media, no records, nothing. Then I started looking at the city's budget reports. It took me hours, but I finally found it, buried in a footnote under the Department of Public Health. There was a line item for winter shelter clear-out and disposal services. The contractor listed was City Abatement Services, LLC. The amount was redacted. I sat there staring at the screen, trying to piece it together. The homeless encampment sweeps. The timing right after New Year's, the bags, the bodies. They weren't cleaning up trash, they were cleaning up people. I quit Cascade the next day. I didn't give notice, I just didn't show up. I moved to Spokane 3 weeks later and got a job doing data entry for an insurance company. I don't drive anymore. I don't even like being near garbage trucks. But about 6 months ago, I was processing a new contract at work and I saw the name City Abatement Services, LLC. The contact listed was Gus Solis. I locked my office door and I threw up in the trash can. I still don't know what to do about it. I can't go to the police. I can't prove anything. And honestly, I'm terrified of what might happen if I try. So I just keep my head down. I do my work. And I try not to think about how many bags I loaded before I opened that one. How many people I crushed without even knowing it. But every January 2nd, I check the news. And every year, the mayor gives the same press conference, bragging about record low homeless counts. We're cleaning up our streets, he says. And I know exactly what that means. I still think about those 3 weeks I spent in that tower. This was back in January of 2019, and I was finishing up my geology master's at Boise State. I needed somewhere quiet to work on my thesis, and when I saw the posting for a winter fire lookout position in the Frank Church Wilderness, I jumped on it. The pay wasn't great, but it came with total isolation, which was exactly what I needed. Plus, I'm originally from Coeur d'Alene, so I'm used to the cold and the woods. I figured it would be perfect. Just me, my laptop, and 40 miles of nothing in every direction. The Forest Service ranger who dropped me off was this guy named Jason Malone. He seemed nice enough. A little quiet, maybe. But he helped me haul my supplies up the final stretch to the tower. He showed me the basics. The wood stove, the radio protocols, the telescope for checking distant smoke. Before he left, he mentioned the previous lookout, an older guy everyone called Old Man Nelson. Jason said Nelson had gone out, said, for a hike last February and never came back. They found his snowshoes about 2 miles down the ridge, but nothing else. He told me this in the most casual way possible, like he was talking about the weather. I asked if that kind of thing happened often, and he just shrugged and said, the wilderness could be unforgiving. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I'd wake up, make coffee on the stove, and work on my thesis until my eyes couldn't focus anymore. At night, I'd sit by the telescope and stare out at the valleys below. It was so quiet up there. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. The tower creaked when the wind picked up and the stove popped when the wood settled. But other than that, it was just me in the mountains. I loved it, honestly. I felt more productive in those first few days than I had in months. About a week in, I found Nelson's logbook. It was tucked behind some canned goods on a shelf above the radio. I don't know why I started reading it. Curiosity, I guess. Most of it was standard stuff. Weather observations, temperature readings, notes about wildlife. But then I got to the last week of entries, and the tone completely changed. Nelson had started counting trees in Valley 4, which is the big drainage directly west of the tower. On January 15th, he counted roughly 500 trees using the telescope. On January 20th, he counted again and noted only 450. He wrote, "I think I'm going crazy," in the margin. I remember laughing when I read that. I figured the guy had cabin fever or something. But then I looked out at Valley 4 myself, and I don't know. Something about it did look different. Thinner, maybe. I told myself I was being paranoid and went back to work. That night, though, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those missing trees and about Nelson disappearing. Around 2 a.m., I was lying in my cot, staring at the ceiling when I felt it. The floorboards were vibrating. It was subtle at first, but then I realized the whole tower was shaking slightly. There was this low hum coming from somewhere outside. So deep, I felt it more than heard it. It made my chest feel tight, like I couldn't breathe properly. I got up and looked out the windows, but I couldn't see anything. The forest was pitch black and the stars were hidden behind clouds. The hum continued for maybe 20 minutes, and then it just stopped. The silence afterward felt heavier somehow. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been an earthquake, or maybe some weird acoustic effect from the wind. I didn't want a radio base and sound like an idiot, so I kept it to myself. 2 days later, I was sweeping the floor when I noticed one of the boards was loose. I pried it up thinking maybe I'd find a mouse nest or something, but instead there was a small metal tin wedged into the gap. Inside the tin was a roll of old film negatives. I held them up to the window trying to make out the images. They were long exposure shots, taken at night, all pointed at Valley 4. I couldn't see much detail without developing them properly, but there were these bright spots scattered across the frames. Dozens of them arranged in patterns that didn't look natural. That's when I started feeling genuinely uneasy. Nelson had hidden these for a reason. I thought about hiking down into Valley 4 to check it out myself, but the snow was too deep and I didn't have snowshoes. Instead, I spent the afternoon scanning the valley with the telescope. During the day, everything looked normal, just trees and snow and the occasional elk. But I kept thinking about those negatives and about the humming sound. Something wasn't right. That night, I forced myself to stay awake. I sat by the telescope with every light in the tower off and watched Valley 4. Around midnight, I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw it again. A faint greenish glow moving through the trees. Then another. And another. They weren't flashlights. The light was too diffuse and it had this weird quality to it, like it wasn't quite visible. I grabbed the camera Nelson had left behind and tried to take pictures using the longest exposure I could manage. Through the viewfinder, I could see them clearly. Dozens of lights moving in organized lines through the forest. My hands were shaking as I radioed base. It was almost 1 a.m., but someone was supposed to be monitoring the frequency. A voice crackled through. It was Jason. I told him I was seeing lights in Valley 4 and that I thought there might be people down there. There was a long pause. When he responded, his voice sounded different. Flatter somehow. He said I should hold position and that a maintenance crew would come up in the morning to check my equipment. He said I was probably seeing equipment reflections or maybe northern lights. I told him I knew what northern lights looked like, and this wasn't that. He just repeated that someone would be up in the morning and then signed off. I felt my stomach drop. Something about that conversation was wrong. Jason hadn't asked me any follow-up questions, hadn't seemed concerned at all. I looked through the telescope again, and that's when I saw it. A vehicle was moving up the access road toward the tower. It was still miles away, but I could track its headlights as it wound through the switchbacks. Except it didn't have headlights. I could only see it because of the moonlight reflecting off white metal. It was a snow cat, painted matte white, and it was heading straight for me. That's when I understood. Base wasn't going to help me because base was compromised. Whatever was happening in Valley 4, someone in the Forest Service knew about it. I thought about Nelson, about how they'd never found his body, only his snowshoes. I thought about how casually Jason had told me that story. My heart was pounding. I didn't have much time. The snowcat would be here in maybe an hour and a half, given the terrain. I grabbed my pack and stuffed in everything I could. The film negatives, my camera, the memory cards, some food, a headlamp, matches. I pulled on every layer I had and laced up my boots. The only way out was the backside of the peak, a steep avalanche chute that dropped almost 2,000 feet. It was insanely dangerous, especially at night, but staying in the tower felt worse. I could hear the snowcat's engine now, a distant growl getting louder. I climbed down the tower ladder and started post-holing through the snow toward the chute. My legs were burning within minutes, and I was sweating despite the cold. I didn't dare use my headlamp. Behind me, I could see the glow from the snowcat's floodlights as it reached the tower. I heard voices shouting, men calling out for me to come back. I didn't stop. I reached the edge of the chute and hesitated. It was so steep I couldn't see the bottom. But I didn't have a choice. I sat down and started sliding using my boots and hands to control my descent. I don't know how long that descent took. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 20 minutes. I slammed into trees and rocks, and at one point I thought I'd broken my wrist. But the snow was so deep, it cushioned most of the impacts. When I finally reached the bottom, I was completely disoriented. I had no idea which direction led to the highway. I picked what I hoped was east and started walking. The sun came up around 7 a.m. By then I'd been walking for maybe 5 hours, and my legs felt like they were going to give out. That's when I saw it, a logging road. I followed it until I hit an actual paved highway, and then I just stood there with my thumb out. An RV pulled over after about 15 minutes. The couple inside were retirees from Oregon, and they didn't ask too many questions when I said I'd gotten lost hiking. They drove me to the nearest town, a place called Salmon, and dropped me at a gas station. I didn't call the Forest Service. Instead, I went to the library, used their computer, and sent an email to the FBI field office in Boise. I attached the photos I'd taken and explained everything. Then I mailed the film negatives to the same office using an envelope I bought at the post office. After that, I got on a Greyhound and went back to Boise. I didn't tell anyone else what had happened, not even my advisor. 3 months later, I got a call from an FBI agent named Rita Drummond. She said they'd opened an investigation based on my report. They'd gone into the Frank Church wilderness with warrants and found evidence of large-scale timber theft, old-growth cedar trees being cut and transported out using portable electric chainsaws and battery-powered winches to avoid detection. The operation had been running for at least 2 years and was worth millions. They'd arrested 6 people, including 2 Forest Service employees. She thanked me for coming forward and said they'd likely prevented further environmental damage. I asked her if they'd found anything else. She paused and then told me they'd recovered human remains in Valley 4. A body had been hidden inside a hollowed-out tree stump and partially preserved by the cold. Dental records confirmed it was Nelson. She said it looked like he'd been murdered. Blunt force trauma to the head, and then concealed. She asked if I wanted witness protection, but I said no. I just wanted to finish my thesis and move on. I did finish my thesis. I graduated that May and took a job with a mining company in Nevada, somewhere flat and open with no trees. I still think about those 3 weeks in the tower, though. I think about Nelson and about how close I came to ending up like him. I think about the men in the snowcat and whether they ever figured out who I was. Mostly I think about the Forest Service employees who sold out their oaths for money. Who does that? Who looks the other way while someone steals a forest and murders a man? I don't have answers, and I don't think I ever will. All I know is I'll never spend another night alone in the woods. I still hear that sound sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. That rhythmic clack, clack, clack of a roller coaster chain climbing the hill. Most people love that sound. It means anticipation, excitement, the thrill that's about to come. To me, it sounds like a meat grinder chewing on something it shouldn't be chewing on, something with gristle and bone. This happened back in early January 2019. I was working as a ride mechanic at Timbertown, USA, this old roadside amusement park, just outside Snoqualmie, Washington. If you've ever driven through the area, you might have seen it from the highway. The rusted Ferris wheel, the faded wooden signs, the empty parking lot. The place had been around since the 70s and it showed. Peeling paint, rusted bolts, rides that groaned and creaked, even when they were running perfectly. The whole park had this sad, abandoned carnival vibe, even when it was open. But it was work and the pay wasn't terrible, so I stuck with it. I'd been there about 3 years at that point. So I knew every inch of that park. Every sound, every smell, every weird quirk of every attraction. The park closed in late October for the winter, and we spent November doing what we called winterization, draining the water rides, covering everything up, doing basic maintenance to make sure nothing fell apart during the cold months. It was boring work, but necessary. That year we had this new seasonal kid helping out. His name was Caleb, and he was maybe 19 or 20. Good kid, quiet, worked hard, didn't complain. He'd been with us through the summer and stayed on for the winterization crew. I remember he was always early to work, and he actually seemed to care about doing the job right, which was rare for seasonal help. Around mid-November, he just stopped showing up. My supervisor, Randall, told me Caleb had quit without notice. Said he'd gotten a better offer somewhere else and just bailed. I remember being a little annoyed because we were already short-staffed, but I didn't think much of it beyond that. People quit all the time, especially seasonal workers. They get bored, or they find something that pays better, or they just decide the work isn't for them. It happens. Winter in the Pacific Northwest is wet and cold, but not always snowy. That year, we got hit with a weird cold snap in December that lasted through January. The kind of cold that makes your bones ache. The park was completely shut down, and I was only coming in once a week to do basic checks. Make sure pipes hadn't frozen. reset breakers, check for any obvious damage, that kind of thing. It was easy money, and I didn't mind the solitude. There's something almost peaceful about an empty amusement park in winter. No screaming kids, no terrible pop music blasting from the speakers, just silence and cold air. One of the rides that kept giving me trouble was the log flume. It's this old water ride where you sit in a fake log boat and it takes you up a lift hill, then drops you down a chute into a big splash pool. The whole thing ran on a massive chain system, and for some reason the lift hill motor kept overheating all winter. Every time I came in, the breaker would be tripped and I'd have to reset it. The first couple times I thought maybe it was a fluke. Old equipment does weird things in the cold, but it kept happening week after week. Same motor, same tripped breaker. I called Randall about it in late December, and he told me not to worry. He said it was probably just the cold, messing with the wiring, and to keep resetting it until we could get a proper electrician out there in the spring. Budget was tight, and bringing someone out for what seemed like a minor issue didn't make sense to management. So that's what I did. Every week I'd come in, find the breaker tripped, flip it back on, and leave. The motor would run for a few seconds, making this grinding sound. Then it would trip again. I figured something was jamming the chain, but I wasn't about to crawl into that gear pit in the middle of winter. It could wait until spring. I never thought twice about it. By early March, the park was getting ready to reopen for the season. That meant full inspections of every ride and a deep cleaning of all the water attractions. I got assigned to the log flume, which made sense since I'd been dealing with that motor issue all winter. The forecast said it was going to be a clear day, so I drove out there on a Tuesday morning. It was the first week of March, and there was still a chill in the air, but the sun was out for once. It was still cold, maybe 40 degrees. And the park looked eerie in that early spring light. No crowds, no music, just empty walkways and silent rides. The shadows were long, and everything had this abandoned feel to it. I grabbed my toolbox and headed over to the log flume. The whole ride was drained for the winter, so the channel was just this long, empty trough filled with dead leaves, dirt, and this gross, blackish sludge that builds up when water sits stagnant for months. The smell hit me before I even got close. That stagnant pond smell mixed with rotting vegetation. I'd have to clean all that out eventually, but first I needed to figure out what was wrong with the motor. I walked around to the base of the lift hill where the main drive system was housed. That's when I noticed the other smell, the one that didn't belong. It wasn't rot exactly. It was more like burnt grease or overheated metal mixed with something organic I couldn't quite place. I figured it was just the motor. It had been running hot all winter after all. Maybe a dead animal had crawled in there and gotten cooked by the heat. It wouldn't be the first time. I climbed the metal staircase that ran alongside the lift hill. The stairs were slick with moisture, and I had to be careful not to slip. The railing was ice cold under my hand. As I got higher, the smell got stronger. My stomach started to twist, but I told myself it was just the motor, burning off old lubricant or maybe a dead rat or something. Nothing to worry about. When I reached the top of the lift hill, I could see the whole park spread out below me. From up there, Timbertown looked almost peaceful. The Ferris wheel stood still against the gray sky. The carousel was covered in a blue tarp. The midway stretched out empty and quiet. I turned my attention to the chain mechanism. The lift chain runs through a big gear system at the top, and I could see right away that something was wrong. The chain was jammed. Not just stuck, but really wedged in there. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it down into the gear pit. to get a better look. That's when I saw the blue fabric. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was tangled up in the main drive gear, wound tight around the metal teeth like someone had fed it through on purpose. I leaned in closer and my heart started pounding. It was a jumpsuit, a mechanic's jumpsuit, the same kind we all wore. Blue, cotton with reflective strips on the shoulders. I felt my hands start shaking as I angled the flashlight to see more. The fabric wasn't empty. There was something inside it. Something that had been there for a very long time. I stumbled backwards and almost fell down the stairs. My brain was trying to process what I'd just seen, but it didn't make sense. I leaned back and forcing myself to look again. That's when I saw the boots. Steel-toed work boots wedged at an angle against the gear housing. They were scuffed and dirty, and I recognized them immediately. They had a distinctive scuff mark on the left toe, a deep gouge in the leather. Caleb's boots. Caleb wore those boots every single day. I remember because he was proud of them. Said his dad had given them to him when he got the job. My stomach dropped. Caleb didn't quit. He was here. He'd been here the whole time, trapped in the machinery while I was resetting that breaker every week, while I was complaining about the cold and the early mornings, while I was going home to my warm apartment. He was here. Or what was left of him was here. I pulled out my phone to call Randall, but my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. My fingers were numb from the cold and from shock. Before I could dial, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The warning siren. That loud automated blare that signals a ride is about to start. The automated start sequence had been triggered. Someone in the control tower must have queued up a test run for the morning, standard procedure before opening day. I looked down at the gear pit. If the chain started moving now, it would pull whatever was left of Caleb through the final pinch point. I screamed into my radio for them to shut it down, but there was no response. Either no one was listening or they couldn't hear me over the siren. The motor kicked on with a deep mechanical hum. I could feel the vibration through the platform under my feet. The chain lurched forward 1 inch, then another. I watched in horror as the gears began to turn. There was a terrible grinding sound, metal on metal, and something wet tearing. Then something gave way. The obstruction cleared. The body, or what was left of it, dropped into the dry trough below with a wet thud that I can still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't a clean drop. It was heavy and wrong and final. The chain kept moving. A log boat that had been parked at the base of the lift hill started climbing toward me, empty and cheerful. It reached the top, crested the hill, and began its descent down the empty slide. I watched as it pushed the remains down the dry channel, leaving a dark smear on the fiberglass. The boat moved smoothly, like nothing was wrong, like this was just another test run. I turned away and threw up right there on the platform. My whole body was shaking, and I couldn't breathe right. I don't remember climbing down the stairs. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on the ground with my back against the fence, my whole body shaking. My hands were still gripping my phone. I finally managed to call Randall. I could barely get the words out, but I told him what I'd found. My voice didn't sound like my own. He didn't believe me at first. I had to repeat it 3 times before it sank in. He told me to stay put and not touch anything. Within an hour, the park was swarming with police and investigators. They cordoned off the whole area, and I had to give a statement. Then another statement. Then another one. After that, the park closed for what they called unforeseen maintenance. The official report said Caleb died instantly in November during winterization. They said he must have been working alone on the lift mechanism, lost his footing, and fell into the gear pit. The machinery caught him and he was killed on impact. That was the story they put out, and that was the story that stuck. Quick, painless, accidental, a tragedy, but not a horror. But I know the truth. I found Caleb's flashlight 2 days later when I went back with the investigators. It was in the bottom of the gear pit, half buried in the sludge. The lens was covered in scratches, deep scratches like someone had been banging it against the metal casing over and over, trying to signal for help, trying to get the attention of the security cameras that no one was watching, trying to make noise so someone would hear. Someone like me. The thing that haunts me most is the timeline. Caleb went missing in mid-November. The park was completely empty after that. No visitors, no staff, nobody. No one was supposed to be there except me, and I was only coming in once a week. Every time I reset that breaker, I was forcing the gears to try and turn 1 more inch against the obstruction. Against him, the motor would run, the gears would try to turn, then it would trip and shut off. I thought it was just a mechanical problem. I didn't know what I was doing. I don't know if he died right away or if he was trapped there for hours, maybe even days. In the cold and the dark. I don't know if he was still alive any of the times I was there. I don't know if he could hear my footsteps on the pavement below or my truck pulling into the parking lot. I don't know if he was banging that flashlight while I was standing 50 feet away complaining about the breaker. I don't know if he screamed, and I just couldn't hear him over the wind. I'll never know. I quit 2 weeks later. I couldn't be there anymore. Couldn't walk past that ride or hear the sound of the chain or smell that burnt grease smell without feeling like I was going to be sick. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those boots. I saw the blue jumpsuit tangled in the gears. I heard that wet thud. The park reopened in April with a new crew. They scrapped the log flume entirely and put in some spinning teacup ride in its place. They ripped out the whole system, the gears, the chain, the trough, everything. I heard they settled with Caleb's family quietly. No lawsuits, no media attention, just a payout and a non-disclosure agreement. His name never made the news. It was like he'd never existed. I think about him a lot. I think about how he must have felt trapped in that gear pit, knowing the park was closed and no one was coming. I think about the cold, the Pacific Northwest cold that seeps into your bones. I think about the flashlight scratches and what it must have been like to bang on metal for hours, knowing no one could hear you. I think about whether he was conscious when I reset the breaker that first time, whether he felt the gears try to turn. Most of all, I think about the sound of that motor every time I reset the breaker. That low mechanical hum as the gears tried to turn. I thought it was just a machine fighting against a jam, a stuck chain or a bent gear. I didn't know it was a person fighting to stay alive. I didn't know I was the one hurting him. I haven't been back to that park and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear that sound. Clack, clack, clack. Like a chain pulling something up a hill, like a machine that doesn't care what it's processing, like metal teeth chewing through fabric and bone. The automation doesn't care. It just follows its programming. It just keeps trying to run no matter what's in the way. People think machines are neutral, that they can't hurt you unless someone programs them to. But that's not true. A machine will process anything you feed it. Wood, plastic, bone. It's all the same to the gears. And I was the one who kept feeding it power. I was the one who kept pressing reset week after week after week. I've worked in forensics for 7 years now, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that evidence doesn't lie. It doesn't have opinions. It doesn't have motives. It just exists waiting to be interpreted. But what they don't tell you in training is that sometimes evidence can point back at you in ways you never imagined. This happened in January of 2020, and I still don't know if I made the right call. I'm a forensic technician for the Eugene Police Department in Oregon. It's not the most glamorous job in the world, but I liked it. There's something satisfying about finding that one fiber, that one print that cracks a case wide open. I wasn't a detective, but I was good at my job. My supervisor used to joke that I had a sixth sense for detail. I wish I'd used that sixth sense a little earlier. The case started 3 years before I got involved. They called it the New Year's dismemberment case, though we tried to keep that name out of the press. Every January 2nd, like clockwork, a piece of luggage would turn up somewhere in the Eugene metro area. Inside would be a body part, always frozen solid, always carefully wrapped, always a different piece of the same victim. The first year, it was a torso in a Samsonite hardshell left in a Goodwill donation bin. The second year, it was legs in a vintage leather duffel abandoned at a bus stop. By year 3, the media had caught wind of it, and the pressure on our department was intense. I wasn't lead on the case, but I processed every piece of evidence that came through. The cuts were surgical precise. Whoever was doing this had medical knowledge, or at least access to the right tools. The freezing was methodical too. These weren't heat-of-the-moment kills. This was planning. This was control. The thing that haunted me most was that we never found a head, never got an ID on the victim. It was like this person had been erased from existence one piece at a time. January 2nd, 2020 started like any other winter morning in Eugene. Rain, drizzling down, gray skies, low visibility, terrible. I got the call around 9 a.m. Another suitcase had been found this time near the Willamette River bike path. I grabbed my kit and headed out with my partner Luis. The scene was already cordoned off by the time we arrived. A jogger had spotted it sitting upright against a tree, like someone had just set it down for a moment. The suitcase itself caught my attention immediately. It was vintage, maybe from the 70s. Pierre Cardin brand, with that distinctive geometric pattern on the side panels. One of the wheels was broken, hanging at an odd angle. I remember staring at it for what felt like a full minute before Luis asked if I was okay. I wasn't okay. I knew this suitcase. I'd seen it before. 2 years earlier, in December of 2017, my buddy asked me to help him move apartments. We'd been friends since college, roommates actually. He was one of those guys who seemed to have everything figured out. Steady job, decent apartment, always knew the right thing to say. That day, we'd hauled boxes and furniture up 3 flights of stairs, and I remembered complaining about how heavy one particular suitcase was. He'd laughed it off, saying it was full of old books he couldn't bear to throw away. That suitcase had a broken wheel. I joked about it. I told him he should just toss it and buy a new one. I forced myself to focus. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was a different bag. Pierre Cardin wasn't exactly rare. I pulled on my gloves and carefully opened the latches. Inside, wrapped in layers of plastic, was a severed foot. Female, probably mid-20s. But that's not what made my stomach drop. Tucked beside the foot was a crumpled party hat. One of those cheap foil ones you get at New Year's parties. This one had gold lettering that said Happy New Year 2018. There was a stain on the brim, dark red. Wine. I flashed back to New Year's Eve 2017. I'd gone to a party at my friend's new apartment. It was a small gathering, maybe 15 people. At some point in the night, I'd been standing near the kitchen, holding a bottle of red wine, when someone bumped into me. The wine had splashed all over this girl's party hat. She'd laughed about it, said it gave the hat character. I remembered her face vaguely. Blonde hair, bright smile. I remembered her leaving early, or at least I thought she'd left early. Luis noticed I'd gone pale. He asked if I needed to step away, but I shook my head. I needed to see everything. I needed to know. I carefully moved the plastic aside and found something else. A Polaroid photo. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. The photo showed a party. I recognized the apartment immediately. It was the same New Year's Eve gathering. The focus was on someone standing in the living room, holding a champagne glass, smiling at the camera. But it was the background that made my blood run cold. Behind him, in the reflection of the sliding glass door, you could see into the hallway. The bedroom door was slightly open. Through that crack, barely visible, was what looked like a hand on the floor. Pale, bound with rope or tape. And standing right next to that bedroom door, oblivious drink in hand, laughing at something someone said, was me. I carefully bagged the photo without saying a word to Luis. I logged it into evidence. I did everything by the book. But my mind was racing. I'd been at that party. I'd been standing right there. Had someone been dying just feet away from me while I laughed and drank and celebrated? The thought made me physically sick. I couldn't process the rest of the scene. I told Luis I was feeling ill, which wasn't a lie, and headed back to the station. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to breathe, trying to think. I needed to talk to him. I needed answers. But I also needed to be smart about this. If I went to my supervisor, if I told anyone about my connection to that suitcase, I'd be pulled from the case immediately, maybe even investigated myself. I decided to handle it quietly. That evening, I drove to his apartment. I hadn't seen him in a few months. We drifted apart the way friends sometimes do when life gets busy. He answered the door with a smile, like nothing in the world was wrong. He invited me in, offered me a beer. I declined. I told him I needed to ask him about something. He tilted his head, curious. I asked him about the suitcase. The Pierre Cardin with the broken wheel. His smile didn't falter. He said he'd donated it years ago, said it was falling apart anyway. I asked him when exactly, and he thought for a moment, then said probably early 2018. I watched his face carefully. There was no nervousness, no tells, just casual conversation. Then I asked him about the New Year's Eve party, about the girl with the wine-stained hat. His expression shifted slightly. Not panic, something else. Recognition, maybe. He said he remembered her, said she'd left early with some guy she'd met at the party, said he never saw her again. I pulled out my phone. I'd taken a photo of the Polaroid before logging it. I shouldn't have, but I did. I showed it to him. I pointed out the reflection in the glass, the hand on the floor. I asked him what that was. He set his beer down slowly. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he smiled again, but this time it was different. Colder. He said I had a good eye. Always had. He said that's what made me good at my job. He poured himself another beer, taking his time. Then he sat down across from me and said something I'll never forget. He said I'd been a great guest that night, that I'd helped him carry ice from his car, that I'd helped him move the couch to make more room for dancing, that I'd stayed late, helping him clean up after everyone else left. He said in some ways, I'd been the perfect accomplice. He leaned forward and his voice dropped. He told me that if he went down, if the police came for him, he'd tell them I knew. He'd tell them I helped. He'd say I was in on it from the beginning. I felt like the room was spinning. I told him he was insane. I told him I'd turn him in right then and there. He laughed. He asked me if I had any proof. The suitcase was circumstantial. The photo didn't show a crime, just a hand that could be explained away. And my presence in that photo, my connection to him, that made me look complicit. He said even if I reported it now, after sitting on it for hours after visiting him alone without backup, I'd destroyed any credibility I had. He stood up and walked to the window. He said the killings would stop. He said he was done anyway. It had been 3 years and he'd gotten what he needed out of it. He said all I had to do was keep quiet, process the evidence like normal, let the case go cold. In return, he'd make sure nothing ever pointed back to me. I left without saying another word. I drove around for hours trying to figure out what to do. Every option felt wrong. If I reported him, I'd ruin my career, maybe face charges myself for withholding evidence, for visiting him without notifying my supervisor. If I stayed silent, a killer walked free. But there was no head, no ID, no way to definitively prove the victim's identity or where she'd been killed. The case was circumstantial at best. I made my choice. I went back to the station. I processed the evidence from that day's scene. I ran the usual tests. I found nothing conclusive. No DNA. No prints that weren't already contaminated. I wrote it up in my report. The case stayed open, but leads dried up. The task force eventually scaled back. There was no fourth year, no suitcase in January 2021, or 2022 or 2023. The case went cold. I'm still working in forensics. I still process evidence. I still pride myself on being thorough. But every New Year's Eve I get a text. It's always the same, just a photo. Sometimes it's a suitcase. Sometimes it's a party. Sometimes it's just a reflection in glass. The caption always says the same thing. Happy New Year. I've thought about turning him in 1,000 times. I've thought about confessing what I know. But the truth is I'm trapped. He was right about one thing. I am complicit. Not because I knew, not because I helped, but because I chose silence. I chose my career over justice. I chose myself over a victim whose name I'll never know. They say evidence doesn't lie, but people do. And sometimes the worst lies are the ones we tell ourselves. I tell myself I made the practical choice. I tell myself there wasn't enough proof. I tell myself that turning him in wouldn't have brought anyone back. But late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder about that girl with the wine-stained hat. I wonder if she screamed. I wonder if I could have heard her if I'd just paid attention. I wonder if she knew how close help was, how close I was. And I wonder what that makes me.